This is Going Inside, Healing Trauma from the Inside Out. Hosted by me, licensed trauma therapist John Clark, Going Inside is a weekly podcast on a mission to help you heal from trauma and connect with your authentic self. Tune in for enlightening guest interviews, immersive solo deep dives, real-life therapy sessions, and soothing guided meditations. Follow me on socials at John Clark Therapy on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube, and apply to work with me one-on-one at johnclarktherapy.com. Thanks for being here. Let's dive in. Emily Powell is a pre-licensed therapist working in the Philadelphia area. Emily works with older teens and young adults in empowering them to become the most authentic version of themselves. Emily, thank you so much for being on the show. Yeah, really appreciate you being here and being up for this.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to get to chat today.
Definitely. I had mentioned that I came across your stuff on Instagram. You make a lot of really
hmm
great therapy content, also some great content around parts, IFS, some of which we'll get into today. But yeah, I'd love to hear just a little bit more about kind of who you are and how you got here. And then we'll get into our topic, kind of exploring themes today around IFS and early attachment wounds as they impact young adulthood.
Yeah, sure. So I am a relatively new therapist. This is my second full year, and I'm loving it. And I always knew that there was more to therapy than just like the cognitive stuff, but I didn't have the language or the understanding or the training to really know exactly what I was looking for. Um, year starting the year two of my practice, I stumbled across IFS. It's kind of everywhere at this point,
Yeah.
and I dove into the IFS CA stepping stones, and everything just made sense to me. I had started with a more psychodynamic relational type approaches. I knew that CBT wasn't where I wanted to go with my practice just based on my own experience with CBT. And finding IFS was just the perfect mix of everything that I wanted, like psychospiritually and relationally. So I'm at the early stages still, just out of the 4-month training, but I'm so excited to see where I go with it.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I'm right there with you in terms of the model having so much to offer, as some have put it. It's one of the most complete models and actually integrates a
hmm
lot of the pieces that you mentioned. My original training was psychodynamic and interpersonal, and then went on to do a lot of CBT work. And there are elements of those within IFS, or even as we think about relationally or tying in this piece about attachment, which attachment is very in vogue right now, kind of in the therapy world.
hmm
And I think a lot of our clients are learning about attachment, and they're coming into the office and going, "Hey, I read this article and I think I'm like anxious avoidant attachment. So like, how do we fix that?"
Right.
you know? So a lot of times I think our clients come in because something is not working, like in one of their relationships, right? And so they're coming in saying, "Hey, I've got this problem," or whenever my partner and I fight, I get really scared they're going to leave me, even though they say they're not going to,
hmm
and then that's becoming overwhelming for my partner. So what do I do? I'm guessing that sounds kind of familiar to
Yep.
your work too
Yep.
with young adults. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So a lot of people come to see me when they're struggling with like these repetitive relational cycles, right? So they're like, I keep having these really similar relationships, and the ending of the relationship feels the same, and I feel the same in the relationship. And the only common denominator is it's me, and I must be the problem. And it's all has to do with myself. And that's where we see so much of the shame coming up. And the work that we get to do together is really understanding like the protectors and the exiles that are coming up based on these really young and vulnerable attachment wounds and exiles.
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe we can talk a little bit about the external versus internal attachments, right? Because the external is a lot of what I think we as therapists know about and clients kind of hear about.
Mhm.
And then in IFS work, we're really working on this internal attachment piece between parts
Mhm.
and self, right? And can create these beautiful repairs, through the work, which will then, by kind of second order change, help clients with the external piece, right? With their
Right.
partner or whatever it is, like, right, that brought them through the door in the first place.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly, which is so beautiful to get to witness,
Mm,
that, like, internal to external shift that happens. Um, but yeah, I think there's so much to discuss there. I mean, the way that our parts relate to one another and have strong feelings towards one another, and then when we enter into this self mode, this newfound curiosity and compassion that we can really tend to these young attachment wounds, like I was mentioning. It's quite profound.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I think at a fundamental level, attachment is kind of like, do I matter and will you be there for me when I need
Yeah,
you, right? And so in the
right.
case of um, IFS, we're often going in and working with what can tend to be really young, vulnerable parts that were very much left behind, or when we're doing the
Mhm.
work and a client encounters one of these parts, it can be like this meeting for the first time, or even parts that have anger around, like, well, where the hell have you been? you know,
Right,
where
right.
I've been here left behind, or in the corner, or locked away in the basement, or whatever it might be in the case of, yeah.
Yeah, yep, exactly. So a lot of the work that I do, I was mentioning to you before, is working with adult children, like young adult children, 20s, 30s, um, who grew up with emotionally immature parents. So in a lot of ways, these really young parts did not get their needs met for whatever the reason, whether there was, significant abuse or neglect, or the parent was absent for whatever the reason, emotionally absent. um, so yes, to working with, the internal attachments that form in relation to how our clients perceive themselves. So like a lot of shame, a lot of protective parts in relationships, um, a lot of firefighters. I work with a lot of, disordered eating, over
Mhm.
exercising, substance, all of those things that come up when we start
Yeah,
talking about all this.
yeah. Yeah, there's this piece, that I see quite a bit around, well, feeling like a burden and fearing being a burden to others, right? So, I was just helping a client this morning, around this fear of, um, uh, basically, like, ending an apartment lease with a friend, right? And so
Mhm.
you have this situation that is, on, at first glance, like, um something that is benign, right? Or like, something that isn't necessarily catastrophic. But depending on your history, your background, there's these pieces around attachment, a big piece around trauma, right? And uh, this idea of like, when I have needs, it's a problem for others, or it's a
Right.
big problem for others, right? Or going back to primary caregivers, right? Or I have food, or it's, I can't believe you're hungry again, right? You know how much this
Mhm.
food costs, or whatever it is, or some mix of reactions, right? And so then this little kid goes, well, I better either not be hungry or figure it out myself, or don't not
Right.
tell anyone, or start hiding food, or whatever it might be, right? But
Mhm.
yeah,
Yeah, exactly, and I think, you know, that's where a lot of the people pleasing and perfectionism comes up,
yeah,
which
yeah.
I love working with, like, this idea, especially in terms of people pleasing, that we have to kind of suss out our parent or caregiver's mood that day to see, like, can we assert our needs, or are we gonna have to keep this one in? And constantly worrying about like how the caregiver is going to react, and then seeing that impact so many, adult relationships of feeling so empty and like misaligned in the relationship, but not knowing why. And it goes
Mm,
back to like these basic needs are not being met emotionally, physically, sexually, like whatever might be coming up.
huge. Yeah, this is
Yeah.
huge. Yeah, and another one is like, let's say, um, my client is like having a really good day, and then their partner comes home, their partner is not having a good day. And then there's something that happens inside around like, well, I should probably not be having such a good day all of a sudden, right?
Mm-hmm.
My partner is
Right.
sad and I'm happy, but I should be sad with them, right? Or it's an assault or whatever
Yeah.
to be happy when they're sad. And so I need to kind of become that, right? And then you see this idea of people kind of losing themselves in a relationship or this enmeshment kind of piece that
Yeah.
happens. Or same thing with a caregiver, right? It's like I can only have my feelings when mom's in a good mood or whatever. And so we do a lot of concealing and
Yeah.
a lot of kind of shape shifting to try to stay safe, right? And
Mm-hmm.
then the line between uh, me and you becomes extremely blurred, right? And
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. And I think, again, that goes back to the emotional immaturity, which I know that's kind of like I mean, for me, that's a newish term based on the book and everything that I think it's Lindsay Gibson put
mm,
out. Um, but this idea that like as a child, we have to actually regulate our caregivers' emotions because they're unable to do so for themselves.
yeah,
So if mom is super upset, like we're expected to be this parentified child in tending to mom's needs, um, which again becomes an exile that we can work with. And I mean, that's one of the reasons I love IFS and parts work is it's so um like non-pathologizing, and it just goes back to like there were all these needs that we didn't get met, and there's a reason that we have all of these parts of us, and it just feels so liberating, especially for some young adults that feel so confused about like who they are and why they feel this way.
yeah,
It's always a powerful model, but just this age group also it feels so meaningful.
yeah. Yeah, I think a lot of folks come into therapy wondering, am I broken or how broken am I? And even this kind of classic views on attachment around like you kind of inherit an attachment style from your
Yeah.
primary caregivers at an early age, and it's a bit of a life sentence, right? It's like it happens, and also, I'm also a parent of a young child, and there's that anxiety too of like my child cries, and then like one book tells me to like wait it out a little bit, another says go in right away and comfort them,
Right.
and it's like every little
Yeah.
moment you're going, am I ruining my child and their attachment? Um,
Yeah.
because of so much of this talk in this literature around like you got one style and that's it, or even for two adults like you've got this style, you've got this style, and like that's just it, they're incompatible or it's always going to be this hard or whatever. Whereas
Mhm.
again, IFS really turns that on its head and looks at this internal attachment piece between part and self, which then
Mhm.
when we work on that piece, when we heal that piece, when we repair those internal attachments and help clients access more self, they go into their relationships having a deeper sense of peace and calm and connectedness inside,
Mhm.
um, so that when we're with our partners, it's not like part to part, right? Or like scared,
Yeah.
anxious, vulnerable part to scared, anxious, vulnerable part, or angry, protector part. And then this like this back and forth, that we get into with
Yeah.
our partners.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's speaks to the power of like multiplicity, right? Like there's
Mhm.
one part that feels anxious in this relationship and it's not all of you, and it doesn't mean that it's who you are at your core, right? And I think back to the kind of pop culture attachment conversation, I think there's a very easy like quickness to like diagnosing people with a certain attachment style, and that's not stagnant, and people get very stuck on that just like we do with like diagnosing and
Yeah.
labeling in all of the ways. And there's so much room for movement and growth
Yeah.
using IFS and like I think a lot of relational models.
Well, it's just so darn tempting to put it into like a quiz on your website of like find out which style are
Right.
you, just like, on Facebook, it's like find out which Disney character you are, like what type of
Exactly.
pasta you are. It's like people want to
Hmm.
know and be like, see, there it is. There's the thing. I'm anxious avoidant. And that's like this silver bullet thing that's going to explain my entire life or whatever. Like
Yeah.
we're always kind of looking for that. We're always looking for answers, right? But a lot of times, clients are looking for like one sweeping kind of like reason for why I am the way I am,
Hmm.
or why, these three relationships have all ended this way, or why, um, like I had like, let's say, I was in a relationship where someone was mean and hurtful and critical, and I keep seeking that out.
Yeah.
What's wrong with me that I keep seeking that out, and on and
Right.
on.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a definite like self-diagnosing thing happening on Instagram and TikTok.
Mm,
And, um, you know, a lot of people come to therapy, especially young adults who are like struggling with their identity in some way with like, I think I have X, Y, and Z, or like, I think I might have, social anxiety or whatever it might be. And for me, it was so liberating to realize like these are just parts of us that are trying to get their needs met. This
yeah,
is so human. And yes, for some, it can help to put some sort of label to gain understanding and clarity around it. But um, at the end of the day, it's just like human responses to the stuff that we have to go through in our
totally.
lives.
Well, you go back to, like a perfectionist part, right, or a client with a
Mm,
strong perfectionist part, and, I've probably used this example in another episode maybe, but, a lot of times it's like people are also looking for like some big T trauma that happened in my life that made me the way I am versus like, let's say you have an adult client who has a really strong perfectionist type. And the way that's showing up is they're really anxious. They're anxious all the time and they really fear
mhm.
screwing up at work or whatever it is. And now they're having sleep issues or whatever. So that's kind of like why they come in. That's the symptom. But in light of this perfectionist part, in inviting them to go inside, connect with that part, get to know it, um, maybe you go back to this memory where I had a violin recital and I had practiced as much as I could. Like I thought I was going to do really well and I played and I missed a few notes. And then on the car ride home, my parents just didn't say much. Right. Or
Right.
they came back stage after the thing. And there was just a sense of like, yeah, you missed a few notes, didn't you? And so then a child who is fundamentally wondering, like, am I lovable or not? Or what do I need to
Mhm.
do to be lovable in the eyes of the people who are here to keep me safe and loved and all this stuff. So then learns, or a part learns, that in order to be lovable or stay lovable, I need to be perfect or as close to perfect as possible. And so next time I need to not miss a note. So then I go
Mhm.
home and I start practicing 3 times as much as I ever did. Fast forward 20 years later, whatever, then, I live in San Francisco, Silicon Valley. It's the land of overachievers and perfectionists, right? And people
Right.
that are profoundly driven, right? And I see a lot of that as parts, right? Like, why do you
Mhm.
need to be so perfect and be the best? Or what would it mean if you're not the best software developer in Silicon Valley? And it feels so high stakes to them, right? But then you go back to that moment of just something as kind of benign as that, like a parent's disappointment, and you might go back and work with that part and be with that part, and
Mhm.
there might be some work to be done there where that part got stuck and was frightened and polarized and has been kind of driving the bus ever since.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that example. I think that's a perfect demonstration that this doesn't have to be about like the quote unquote big T trauma. This is about human connection and the way that sometimes, for whatever the reason, and not to blame anybody, but we didn't get our needs met, right? I think a lot of times this conversation can activate people's parts, especially parents. I'm not a parent yet, so but I can imagine like parents listening and being like, "Oh my god, what if I do like this one thing? Am I going to
Yeah.
forever mess up my kid?" And it's not. always like a blame game or pointing out like what you lacked as a parent or what you didn't do right.
Yeah.
It's just life and like the way that we're trying to deal with all the parts of the external world
Yeah.
too.
Yeah, and to that end, something I'm kind of learning, practicing, um, very imperfectly as a parent, really a new parent, is, knowing what it feels like in my body to be led by a part. Um,
Mm,
and this is kind of like, IFS is not real skills heavy the way of like DBT if you come in or whatever. It's like, skills driven kind of models, but in IFS, like just getting to know what it feels like for me to be in a part, or if someone in my life sends me a text and they're like, um, John, we need to talk. Like that's going to bring up parts, right?
right.
Depending on who it is. And so I might get that text and all of a sudden my body does a few different things, right? Like my stomach clenches, goes like this, my throat is kind of tight, my shoulders are up. Like,
Hmm.
that might be a part, right? Getting ready,
Yeah.
because a part of me, it fears we're in really big trouble or I'm being sent to the principal's office, even though it's
Right.
like a buddy of mine, like, wondering if I've seen his shoes or whatever, like, I don't know
Hmm.
what it's gonna be, right? But, helping our clients understand those cues and when a
Yeah.
part is kind of there and a part is up. So doing that in the session very moment to moment, um, to kind of practice, like, yeah, just knowing what that's like, to be in a part.
Yeah. Yeah. I think so the words that I didn't have when I was, like, in grad school or when I first started learning that I wanted to be a therapist was, like, the cognitive versus, like, the somatic and body-centered approaches, and that's why I love IFS as such an experiential approach, like, this is a whole body, like, mind, spirit
Yeah,
approach, um, and as somebody who has very strong intellectualizer parts. I have to notice that for myself all the time too, even with like what's coming up between me and a client during session. Because what I've noticed is our intellectual parts can really click and we're like,
yeah,
oh yeah, that makes so much sense. And like, oh, we're bringing it back to when this happened with your mom. And it feels really good. And like our intellectualizer parts get really connected. But I'm like, wait, this is not my self mode.
yeah, it's
Um,
not the deeper work, right? It's not
yeah,
when we're here to really do deep healing work, um, that's yeah, that's not quite it. Although it can be helpful, and to your point, yeah, both of your intellectual part and their intellectual part are really liking this, right? And it's actually
right.
it's emotionally, it's a lot safer than kind of going inside and going
Yeah,
there or going to that
right,
painful place or going to that violin recital, right? And actually being there and stepping in and being with that part versus like,
right.
oh yeah, my parents were really critical. And so that makes sense why I'm such a perfectionist, quote unquote, whatever. It's like, okay, we've got that, right? So there's this
Mhm.
working hypothesis. We've kind of agreed upon it. Now what, right? Like, what do we do about it,
Exactly.
right? Um, and yeah, so this like I think a lot of therapies are kind of insight oriented, and again, a lot of the models that I've used over time would be that, right? Or like if you come a client comes in and says, "I feel worthless," and you take a cognitive approach, it's like, "Well, what's the proof that you're worthless?" Right? Like, would a worthless
Mhm.
person have this cool job at Google and a partner and, this cool apartment? Like, "Well, no, it wouldn't." So you can kind of play around with it there, right?
Sure.
And kind of be, kind of doing the math, um, but there's limits to it, right? Versus like, um when you say out loud, "I'm worthless," what happens in your body? Or can you connect with the part of you that says, "I'm worthless," and go a little bit
Mhm.
further? What does that part look like or sound like? Where do you find it? How do you experience it? Okay, how are you feeling toward that part? And that's when the work can really take off with IFS, is actually immediately going in, focusing on this self to part connection and working there versus like,
Right,
I need to convince my client that they're not worthless because they have this
right.
resume of cool stuff they've done. So of course they're not worthless. Like, that's
Mhm.
just too obvious and they won't buy it because they have all these other protectors, around, uh, protecting against feelings of worthlessness, right? Protecting an exile getting flooded with shame, worthlessness, abandonment, whatever it might be.
Hmm. Yeah, and like in that example, I suppose from the therapist's end, that would also be a part of them with an agenda that feels
Yeah.
uncomfortable with their client feeling worthless and is just trying to convince and convince and convince, like, no, I see you, you're not worthless. And we know in reality, like, there's other protectors of that um, are not really going to be like receptive to what the
Yeah.
therapist is saying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And even if the client did buy it, then all of a sudden, in order to keep, uh, in order to not feel worthless, I have to keep coming back to my therapist for my therapist to keep telling me I'm not worthless.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
So there's that piece too, where, um, we have to be mindful of the power we hold. And again, in the psychodynamic model I was trained in, you take the same issue around worthlessness and say, well, I just need to wait for the client to play that out with me. So we have this enriching
Right.
relationship and this attachment between the two of us. And eventually they play out, this worthlessness stuff with me. And once I have built enough relational equity here, I can provide a corrective emotional experience that they would internalize and then take out into the world.
Mhm.
And it does happen, and I've done it, and I've seen it happen. It might take at least 9 months to get there, whereas with IFS, it might take one session. I don't. I've seen it happen,
Yeah.
right off the bat, and just really taking the stance of people have everything they need inside to heal and have a propensity toward self-healing. When we get them
Mhm.
access to self, then self goes in and knows just what to do to help that poor scared girl at her violin recital or whatever it is.
Right. Right. Yeah, I love that idea that we all have the innate capacity to heal. It's so liberating and it's so radical in the world of pathology
Yeah.
and um, the DSM and all of those things.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it kind of takes, we all kind of start out with Carl Rogers in this piece of unconditional positive regard, and that's kind of in there, but this is like that, um, times 100, right? It's like not only, yes, in IFS, like regard your clients positively, but also hold that they have this innate capacity for healing when we help them versus they have a capacity for healing as long as they keep coming back to me because I'm
Exactly.
smart, I have these degrees on the wall, I know a lot, and if you take 9 months to attach yourself to me, I can heal you, right? By
Mhm.
becoming an attachment figure in your life and basically resonating with you and giving you this feeling that hey, you're not worthless after all, and then hopefully you internalize that and take it out there in your life, right? But
Right.
inherently the stance is that you are not enough and you don't have enough and you can't heal without a powerful therapist like me. um
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about the way that it's helpful for therapists and other, helping professionals too, where there's not this sense that like this straight path to burnout where like everyone needs me. But like,
Yeah.
no, there's everyone actually has this capacity to heal. We
Yeah.
can support them in that. Um, but again, it's not as like, oh, if they don't come to session this week, like something's going to happen. And like we have all this power and
Totally.
all this responsibility to somehow like heal every person that we interact with.
I mean, you nailed it, and I've kind of shared this story before, but that what you just described is why I quite literally burned out a couple years
Mm,
ago and had to take a sabbatical, basically, where I went from doing a ton of clinical work for 10 years to doing none at all, and I just couldn't kind of be that person for all these people anymore, right? And be this attachment figure, and also, um, there's a concealing that we do when we need to kind of be a blank slate and have them, you know, uh, play out their transference with us. And
mhm.
the weight of that eventually really got to me. And during my sabbatical, I kind of found IFS and it solved so many problems for me, including that one of like just like
Mhm.
having to be this attachment figure for people and kind of feeling like it was a bit of a mask to wear versus it just feels like a way more free and liberated stance in IFS. And again, just
Yeah.
really honoring that people have self and they have self energy, and we're there to help them access it. And I don't know what to do. I don't know all the answers. I don't know like 5 tips and tricks to help you not have a panic
Right.
attack anymore, right? So it's really a radical, yeah, the IFS talks about the paradigm shift. It is a radical paradigm shift.
Yep, totally. Yeah, and I think it's it's empowering to feel like it's such an intuitive model too, where when we're both in self mode, like it just flows. And it's
Yeah,
like a very it's kind of hard to describe in words because it is so like somatic, I think.
yeah,
But you ask the part and the part will tell you if there's not another part blocking it, right?
yeah,
So it's
yeah,
just it feels so natural and it feels like it does feel so complete.
yeah. Like when I was taught in grad school, is like if you are overwhelmed in session and you don't know what to do, then just go back to, my faculty would call it the love triangle, LUV, listen, understand, and validate. So it's like, okay, if
Mm,
you're kind of lost in the session, you don't know what to do, the client's saying a lot, or, they have talking about 5 different things at once. It's like, just go back to that, like listen, understand, and validate. Like, okay, I can kind of do that. Um, in IFS, like for me and what's worked for me is instead of that, it's really my primary job here is being in self energy myself as much as possible, holding self energy. And when I do that, clients and their parts can feel that. And going back to that piece about no agenda, they can feel I have no agenda. And then paradoxically, the work happens and it's more
mhm,
productive, quote unquote. I did, I did a demo, an IFS demo in Stepping Stones, same program you went to, I went to. And uh, when we started off the session, my client was like, "I don't know, I'm just super overwhelmed today. I have a lot going on. I have a lot to think about. I don't know if I can kind of like, I don't know if I want to like cry today or like go deep or all that." And uh, there were parts of me that wanted to still like do a session or get the practice or even show like the staff that I can do IFS and all that. So I'm aware of all those things happening in the moment, but then in connecting to self and in that sense of having no agenda, I was able to kind of get there and then communicate that to the client and her parts, that
mhm,
I'm totally hearing that there's a lot going on. You've got this, you got to pick up your kid, you have someone knocking at the door right now, all that's happening. And so I want you and your parts to know that nothing needs to happen today in this session. Nothing needs to happen. She's like, "Oh, okay. Okay. Oh, yeah, that's good. Yeah, they're like my parts like kind of appreciate that. Okay, great. So maybe
mhm.
just hang out there with your parts feeling relieved by that." And then, of course, by doing that, we were off to the races, and she kind of
Right.
softened and found a part and kinda went inside, and we ended up working toward this great, this really nice unburdening. And, so I think really going back to that piece of having no agenda and
Mhm,
meaning it is huge. Or, a lot of times I see therapists, especially in private practice, of like, clients coming, they're paying some dollar amount to be here. And so I got to be really helpful, or I got to show them how helpful I can be, or I got to pull out 5 worksheets, so that they come back, right? And think that I'm
right.
helpful and useful. And that's an agenda, right? It's a good
Yeah.
agenda. And we have our therapist parts that want to do good and be a good therapist and be helpful. And like, and it does suck to see a client who's relapsing or who is, uh, yeah, making some decisions that are hurting themselves or the relationships or whatever, or a client whose panic attacks are getting worse and not better, and you're wanting
Mhm.
to rescue them, right? That all makes sense. All those parts make sense because they want to help. And yet, if we just go in and be led by those parts, then we can often overwhelm a client or shut them down, or um, try to teach them this really cool, coping skill, and then they don't know how to do it, and they end up feeling worse about not being able to
Right.
do it. And so then they leave that feeling more helpless at the end of the session, or whatever it might be. So, yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. Oh, you said so much that resonated. Even the part that when you were describing the demo and you said, like, there's no agenda or whatever you said to your client. Even my parts were like, oh, that's so nice. Like, because what other space do we have in this world other than the space we carve out for ourselves, meditation,
Yeah.
sitting, whatever, to just feel like there's no pressure and there is no agenda. And just
Yeah.
seeing what comes up and then sitting with that is revolutionary in today's society.
Well, a lot of meditation, for folks becomes performative as well. It becomes like I'm either good at it or
100%.
not, right? Of like I sit still and I try to just notice my thoughts, and I can only do it for a couple minutes, and I'm frustrated. I'm not doing it right. I'm not good at meditating. Versus an IFS, it's like, what if I just sit, close my eyes, go inside, and just listen, right?
Yeah.
To who's there, what parts are up, and just listen with no agenda. Like that is meditating, right? And
Yep.
it's not this you know, uh, performative thing of like, I got to try to go for 30 minutes in this Zen mode. Or if I'm not Zen, I'm not doing it right. Or if I'm not calm, I'm not doing it right, whatever.
Mhm. Totally. Yeah. And I think just going back to what you said about like what comes up in your body during that time, I think it's a perfect opportunity to check in. Like for me, I first check in like what is happening just somatically. I don't know what part it is. I don't know who's here. But I similarly have like the lump in my throat often related to an exile and the shoulders up.
Yeah.
Um, and then even, there's no time limit or like s- certain script we have to follow, but just seeing like what is that and who's here. And then truly witnessing the like softening of it. And I mean, I've had like headaches that are so related to like my perfectionistic part or like my, overworking part. And just truly like clearing them and not having any headache after like a 20-minute demo session in stepping stones. And I'm like, oh my God, this is magical.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, I'm like a full convert. I have to tone
I
down my
know.
excitement, but yet here I am, like started a podcast about it because I guess I can't tone it down that well. Um, the curiosity and compassion, right, are like the go-tos, right? So, um, and just starting there of like, or even, letting your parts know like I'm here, right? And going back to this attachment piece that you and I like kind of started off with today of like, if I've got a big, thing coming up or a big conversation coming up and this part that's activated and scared and wondering how it's going to go, um, just like if my child, you know, I don't know, she went back to school today after being away for 2 weeks, and there's gonna be new kids there, and, like, it's new and different. I gotta be on time and all that, and, what if I forget my lunch? It's like the same reassurance you would give, a little kid, do
Hmm.
that inside, do that with your parts, right? Like, I hear
Yeah.
you, we're gonna get through this together, right? We're gonna kinda figure it out together. If you do forget your lunch, we'll figure it out together. I know it's
Yeah.
scary, I know this is all scary. Sometimes that can be more than enough, quote unquote, to find relief inside, right? And then over time, this self-leadership piece around my parts can trust me more and can let me
Hmm.
lead. And if I do forget my lunch, we can figure out a solution, or if I do screw up at work, we can figure out a solution. Whereas for
Right.
a lot of clients, I screw up at work and it feels so catastrophic and so high stakes all the
Hmm.
time. And that's just such a exhausting place to be all the time, right?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And just one more thing about like the compassion and curiosity. I think we also said this in the beginning, but the power that this has to also externalize to the outside world in the way that we connect with other people and how liberating it can be to lead with, when you are self-led, to lead with this compassion and understand that like the person in the car didn't cut you off because like they hate you or like because they suck and they're a horrible person. Like they cut you off because X, Y, and Z and they have all these parts and they were activated. And it's just, for me, it's been so amazing in becoming more like just understanding of the world around me and all the crazy stuff that's going on.
Yeah.
Um, it's it feels like a weight off my shoulders in a lot of ways.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, we could do a whole nother episode about this, but it is quite literally a different way of walking through life. It is like a
Yeah.
worldview, to your point, and it has changed my
Mhm.
life in that way of like, if I'm, I'm if like ordering coffee and the cashier is like a little short with me, and that activates a part in me. Um,
Mhm.
like if we see that through parts, right, or that person has a part that's activated or whatever, and that activated a part in me, then we can just kind of see that for what it is and really
Right.
humanize one another pretty much immediately. Um, and I can still see the person as a whole, right?
Right.
Versus like, this is an attack on me, or how dare they, or whatever. We just get into that, um, get into parts being up or whatever.
Mm.
Um, yeah, it's pretty radical.
Yeah.
Yeah. We got we're pretty much right at time here, but I guess definitely let people know how they can find more about you, where they can go, about socials, websites, stuff like that, and then we'll wrap it
Yeah.
up.
Sure. So my socials and my website are Emily Powell Counseling Services. So my name and then counseling services. And I think that's across Instagram, TikTok, and my website.
Very good. Yeah, so people can reach out and definitely follow along with Emily and her content. She's putting out some really great stuff. A lot of
Thank
stuff around
you.
IFS, parts work, attachment, early adulthood. A lot of great stuff. So definitely follow along. We'll be sure to put links to that in the show notes. And yeah, Emily, thank you again for doing this. I really appreciate
Yeah.
it. And yeah, thank you again.
Yeah. Thank you, John.
All right. See you soon. Thanks for listening to another episode of Going Inside. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe wherever you're listening or watching, and share your favorite episode with a friend. You can follow me on Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok at John Clark Therapy, and apply to work with me one-on-one at johnclarktherapy.com. See you next time.